The sky above Tokyo was pale gray, thick with winter haze and streaked with the trails of anti-aircraft shells. It was early 1945, and the hum of distant engines grew into a steady, thunderous roar. Below, air raid sirens screamed across the city, echoing through narrow streets and wooden neighborhoods as civilians rushed for the shelters. High above them, the silver shapes of B-29 superfortresses crossed the morning sun, their shadows drifting over the Imperial Palace grounds. Japanese fighter squadrons scrambled from nearby airfields, aging Ki-43s and Ki-61s clawing for altitude, their pilots bracing for another desperate interception. For months they had fought the bombers alone, burning fuel and blood in futile defiance. But that day, something was different. Out of the sunlight, descending with incredible speed, came smaller, sleeker aircraft, their wings curved, their engines sharper, their presence unexpected. American P-51 Mustangs, painted with the white star of the U.S. Army Air Forces, dived to meet the interceptors. Japanese pilots froze for a heartbeat, disbelief cutting through the chaos. The bombers had escorts, fighters that had crossed the Pacific itself. The protective barrier of distance, the one defense Japan had always trusted, was gone. And from that moment, they knew the war in the sky had changed forever. By 1944, the Pacific War had turned into a relentless struggle for control of the air. Japan's empire, once expanding across the Pacific with frightening speed, had begun to shrink under the crushing weight of American industrial power. Island by island, the United States had advanced, from Guadalcanal to the Gilberts through the Marshalls and Marianas, each step bringing its bombers closer to the Japanese homeland. For Japan, the vast Pacific Ocean had always been its shield. The idea that enemy aircraft could reach the home islands had seemed unthinkable at the start of the war. Yet by mid-1944, that illusion had begun to crack. The capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam gave the Americans new forward bases, perfect launch points for the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, a bomber unlike any the world had ever seen. With a range exceeding 3,000 miles and the ability to carry bomb loads to altitudes above 30,000 feet, it was designed specifically to bring war to Japan's doorstep. The early B-29 missions from China, and later from the Marianas, tested the limits of both technology and endurance. The bombers flew over vast expanses of ocean, often unescorted through turbulent weather and enemy fire. Many crews never returned. At these heights, Japanese interceptors struggled to climb fast enough, their machine guns freezing in the thin air. But while Japan's air defense was weakening, the American bombers still suffered heavy losses. The long distances meant the B-29s had to fly without fighter escort. Their only protection was altitude and formation. Each mission stretched over 3,000 miles of airspace, a round trip that left no room for error. The skies above Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka were filled with smoke, shrapnel, and sacrifice on both sides. In the months that followed, U.S. commanders faced an urgent question: how to protect their bombers over Japan. The answer came from a fighter born not in the Pacific but in Europe, the P-51 Mustang. Originally designed as a British fighter and later refined with the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Mustang had already proven itself over the skies of Germany. It could fly faster, climb higher, and range farther than any previous Allied fighter. With external fuel tanks, it could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, a revolutionary advantage that had turned the tide in Europe's air war. If such range could be replicated in the Pacific, the results could be decisive. Meanwhile, Japan's own air situation was growing desperate. The once proud Imperial Japanese Army Air Service was running out of experienced pilots. Many of the men now defending the homeland had barely finished basic flight training. Fuel shortages crippled operations. Engines were cannibalized from damaged aircraft. Ground crews worked through freezing nights with almost no spare parts. The Ki-43, Oscar, once the nimble backbone of Japan's fighter forces, was now outmatched by American aircraft. The newer Ki-84 Frank and Ki-61 Tony offered improvements, but they arrived too late and in too few numbers to change the course of the war. By late 1944, the United States had achieved air supremacy across most of the Pacific. The Marianas became the launch pad for round-the-clock bombing campaigns. Guam's airfields turned into bustling cities of steel and sweat. alive with thousands of mechanics, ordnance crews, and flight engineers. B-29s lifted off in endless waves, their engines rumbling like a storm over the ocean. But for all their power, the bombers remained vulnerable. The loss rates were climbing, and Japanese pilots, though fewer, still fought with reckless courage. Something had to change before the main offensive against Japan could truly begin. Then came the idea of using the small volcanic island of Iwo Jima, sitting halfway between the Marianas and Japan, as a forward fighter base. Securing it would give the U.S. Army Air Forces a place for emergency landings and long-range escort missions. The cost, however, would be enormous. In February 1945, over 70,000 Marines stormed the island in one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific. By the time the Black Sands were secured, more than 26,000 Americans were killed or wounded. But the island was theirs, and soon its airstrips would roar with the sound of P-51 Mustangs preparing for missions no fighter had ever flown before. For the Japanese high command, the reports were alarming. Radar stations began picking up long-range fighter signals approaching the mainland, aircraft moving with bomber formations, then breaking off to sweep coastal skies. At first, the Japanese believed these were new bombers or reconnaissance planes, but intercepted fragments of radio chatter told a different story. These were fighters, American fighters, operating thousands of miles from their home base. In Tokyo, disbelief gave way to dread. If the Americans could now escort bombers all the way to the heart of Japan, there would be nowhere left to hide. By March 1945, the stage was set. The U.S. 8th and 20th Air Forces prepared the largest raids yet against the Japanese capital. The weather was turning warmer, the fuel reserves were ready, and the first squadrons of P-51Ds were in position on Iwo Jima's rough new runways. The distance to Tokyo, just over 700 miles, was finally within their reach. The bombers would no longer fly alone, and the defenders of Japan were about to face a revelation that would alter the very nature of the Pacific Air War. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang in the Pacific was more than just the appearance of a new aircraft. It was the introduction of an entirely new kind of warfare. The Japanese Air Command, long accustomed to calculating battles based on the limited range of enemy fighters, suddenly faced an opponent that could cross oceans, escort bombers to their most sacred cities, and return safely. The Mustang's long, elegant fuselage and laminar flow wings were not just feats of engineering. They were instruments of inevitability. Its power came from a combination that seemed almost poetic: an American airframe and a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, tuned for high altitude and long endurance. The same design that had conquered the skies of Europe over Berlin now turned eastward, its propellers cutting through Pacific winds toward Tokyo. On the American side, this transformation was deeply strategic. General Curtis LeMay, the hard-edged commander of the 20th Air Force, knew that air superiority could not be won by bombers alone. The B-29s had suffered heavy losses from both anti-aircraft guns and kamikaze-style ramming attacks by Japanese fighters. Every lost bomber meant 11 dead men and thousands of gallons of fuel wasted. The introduction of the Mustang changed that equation overnight. For the first time, American aircrews could see friendly fighters flying beside them, weaving in protective arcs above the massive bomber formations. It was a visible symbol of strength, and morale soared with each mission. The logistics of bringing Mustangs into the Pacific were staggering. Each aircraft had to be shipped in crates across the ocean, reassembled on island airfields carved from coral and volcanic rock. Mechanics worked under rain and tropical heat, surrounded by the smell of oil and sea salt. The first Mustangs deployed to Iwo Jima came from the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups, veterans of the European theater. Their mission briefing was simple but unprecedented: escort B-29s to Tokyo, engage all enemy aircraft, return if you can. The range was immense, over 300 miles round trip, and there was no guarantee of rescue if they went down. Yet these pilots volunteered eagerly, driven by the understanding that their work could finally end Japan's ability to fight from the air. For Japanese pilots, the first encounters with the P-51 were disorienting. They had fought against the slower P-40s and the rugged P-47 Thunderbolts before, but this was different. The Mustang's speed and maneuverability at high altitude were unmatched. It could dive faster, climb steeper, and hold its own in a dogfight with any Japanese plane. The Ki-84. Frank, Japan's most advanced fighter, could compete in brief bursts, but shortages of high-octane fuel made its engines unreliable. Many Japanese planes sputtered or even failed mid-flight, while the Mustangs flew on, unrelenting. Reports began flooding Tokyo's air command. New enemy fighters escorting bombers, unidentified fast aircraft over Kanto, American fighters circling over Tokyo, the Go. Disbelief was so deep that some officers initially assumed these reports were exaggerated, but when Japanese airmen returned from sorties, or when they didn't, the truth became clear. Survivors described scenes of humiliation and shock. They had taken off expecting to target the slow-moving bombers, only to find themselves intercepted by swarms of P-51s that seemed to appear from nowhere. The American pilots were calm, precise, and patient, circling high until the Japanese climbed into their sights. Then in seconds they would dive, guns blazing, and vanish into the clouds. The Mustang's 650 caliber Browning machine guns shredded fragile Japanese aircraft, whose light frames and lack of armor turned even glancing hits into death sentences. In Tokyo, air defense officials scrambled to respond. New formations were ordered. Radar stations on the coast attempted to identify the routes of these mysterious fighters, but by the time warnings reached the capital, the sky was already full of contrails and smoke. The B-29s flew higher and steadier than ever, while Mustangs darted between them and the defenders like hawks among crows. Civilians, too, began to notice something strange. They spoke of smaller American planes now flying low over the countryside, strafing rail yards, convoys, and airstrips, attacks that had once been impossible. The Americans, it seemed, now owned the air. Behind this dominance was a simple but devastating shift in strategy. With Mustangs as escorts, the Americans could now abandon the high-altitude precision bombing that had produced limited results. LeMay ordered a change to low-altitude nighttime incendiary raids designed to burn Japan's wooden cities to ash. On the ground, this decision would result in the firestorms of March 1945, the single deadliest air raid of the war. But in the air, it meant complete control. The P-51s cleared the skies ahead of each mission, ensuring that bombers could fly unopposed into the heart of Japan. For Japanese pilots, every sortie became a suicide run, a hopeless chase against faster, better-equipped enemies who seemed to anticipate every move. For the men flying the Mustangs, there was awe and unease in equal measure. They saw the destruction below with their own eyes, entire districts of Tokyo glowing red in the night. They knew the enemy's courage, but also their desperation. Some pilots described seeing Japanese interceptors diving out of the sun, their machine guns flickering weakly, only to disintegrate under a burst of fire. Others recalled seeing enemy planes deliberately ram the bombers, fragments of wings and fuselages falling into the sea. It was warfare stripped of illusion, mechanical, merciless, and inevitable. Among the Japanese airmen, morale collapsed. Training schools closed, airfields were bombed before planes could even take off, and spare parts vanished. What had once been a proud corps of disciplined aviators became scattered squadrons of frightened young men sent to die for a lost cause. Yet still they flew, guided by duty and the fading promise of the Emperor's divine protection. The Mustang's arrival had exposed a brutal truth. Japan's war in the air was already lost, even before the firebombs and atomic blasts that would follow. And yet amid this collapse, there were moments of defiance, flashes of courage that would echo long after the war. Japanese aces like Major Teruhiko Kobayashi continued to fight with extraordinary skill, leading last-stand missions that pitted handfuls of outdated planes against hundreds of Americans. But even they knew it was over. The new American fighters could fly to Tokyo and back. The sea was no longer a shield, and the sky was no longer Japanese. The next phase, the first great escort mission over Tokyo itself, would bring that realization home to every pilot, every civilian, and every leader who still believed Japan could defend its homeland. The moment had come when the skies above the Emperor's capital would belong entirely to someone else. March 4, 1945. Dawn broke over the Pacific with a low mist clinging to the waves and a faint orange glow rising behind Iwo Jima's black volcanic ridges. On the island's rough airstrip, crews were already at work. Mechanics tightened bolts, checked fuel tanks, and loaded ammunition belts into the wings of their newly assembled aircraft. The sound of engines warming filled the air. the steady rumble of Rolls-Royce Merlins tuned for combat. This was no ordinary mission. It was the first full-scale escort operation from Iwo Jima to Tokyo, over 700 miles of open ocean, straight into the heart of Japan. The bombers were already airborne, massive silver B-29s climbing toward their formation point, and behind them, in precise rows, the Mustangs began to lift off, each one carrying a pilot who knew this mission would make history. At 7,000 feet, the sun rose higher, turning the ocean into a sheet of pale light. The pilots of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups checked their instruments, watching the island fade into the distance. Each plane carried extra fuel tanks under its wings, giving it just enough range for the long journey ahead. They flew in disciplined silence, knowing there would be no rescue if they went down. Below them, the Pacific stretched endlessly, a reminder of isolation and risk. Then slowly, black dots began to appear ahead. The B-29s. The Mustangs joined formation, flying close and low, their propellers glinting in the morning sun. For the first time, the great bombers heading for Japan were not alone. In the air defense posts outside Tokyo, alarms blared as radar operators detected the incoming formation. At first, the readings looked impossible. Hundreds of aircraft approaching simultaneously at high altitude and incredible speed. Squadrons of Japanese fighters were scrambled from bases at Atsugi, Chofu, and Yokota. Most of the pilots were young, barely out of training. They had been told that their duty was to stop the bombers, to die if necessary. But as they climbed through the haze, they saw something they had never expected. Fighters escorting the bombers, smaller and faster than the heavy B-29s, breaking away and diving toward them. The first encounters were swift and brutal. P-51 Mustangs dropped their tanks, banked hard, and met the Japanese head-on. Their guns flashed, cutting through the sky with devastating precision. The Ki-43 Oscars and Ki-61 Tonys tried to maneuver, but the Mustangs' speed and climb rate gave them complete control. In seconds, the sky erupted into chaos. Tracer fire, spiraling smoke trails, and parachutes blooming in the cold air. Many Japanese planes exploded before even closing on the bomber formation. Others, damaged and burning, fell toward the distant coastline. From the cockpits of the B-29s, American crews watched in astonishment. Below and around them, the escort fighters danced, diving, climbing, rolling, shielding the bombers from every direction. They were beautiful, one gunner later wrote, like guardian angels with guns. The Japanese response was desperate. Some pilots, realizing they couldn't reach the bombers, turned their attacks toward the escorts themselves. Others, low on fuel or ammunition, resorted to suicide dives, ramming straight into bombers or Mustangs in a final act of defiance. But even these acts could not slow the tide. The Mustangs hunted relentlessly, their long-range endurance allowing them to chase attackers far from the main formation. By the time the bombers reached Tokyo, the sky had been cleared. Over the city, the real storm began. Hundreds of B-29s opened their bomb bay doors, releasing tons of incendiaries and high explosives onto industrial and residential districts. The Mustang pilots circling above could see the fires spreading block by block, black smoke rising in columns, merging into a single choking cloud. From their altitude, Tokyo looked like a sea of embers. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns fired back furiously, but the accuracy was poor. The pilots pressed lower, strafing airfields and rail lines to prevent any additional fighter response. For those watching from below, the sound was overwhelming, a deep, endless roar that seemed to swallow the city whole. On the ground, panic spread faster than the flames. Civilians poured into the narrow alleys and canals, clutching children and belongings. Firefighters fought hopelessly against the inferno as B-29s continued their runs. The Mustang pilots, ordered not to target civilians, focused on military assets, but they could see the devastation below and understood the scale of what was happening. Some later said that the sight haunted them for the rest of their lives. The firestorm of March 9, 1945, would go down in history as the deadliest air raid ever conducted, killing an estimated 100,000 people in a single night. By morning, the Mustangs were low on fuel. They turned south, leaving the burning city behind, and began the long flight back to Iwo Jima. Many barely made it. Some ditched into the sea, their pilots rescued days later by submarines or patrol boats. But the mission was a success beyond anything the U.S. Army Air Forces had imagined. Out of hundreds of bombers, only a handful were lost, the lowest casualty rate of any major raid on Japan to that point. Word spread quickly through the Pacific Command. The Mustangs had done it. The unescorted days were over. In Tokyo, the reaction among surviving Japanese pilots was one of disbelief. The idea that enemy fighters could escort bombers all the way from Iwo Jima to Japan had shattered a fundamental belief of the Imperial Command, that the homeland was unreachable. For years, Japan's war planners had relied on distance as their greatest defense. The Pacific Ocean, vast and unforgiving, had always separated them from the industrial might of the United States. But now, with Iwo Jima secured, that distance had vanished. The Americans could come and go at will, their bombers untouchable, their fighters waiting in the clouds like predators. Reports from the surviving squadrons were grim. Entire air units had been wiped out. Fuel reserves were gone. Factories that once produced aircraft parts were now burned ruins. The pilots who returned described the new enemy fighters in almost mythical terms. Silver Falcons, they called them, faster than wind. For many, the psychological blow was worse than the physical losses. The sky, once a place of Japanese pride and superiority, had become a realm of fear. That raid marked a turning point. The Mustangs had not only changed the course of aerial combat, they had crushed Japan's last illusion of safety. From that day forward, every time the sirens wailed across Tokyo, every time radar screens flickered with new contacts, people looked up knowing that the Americans could be anywhere, at any hour. The ocean barrier was gone, and so was hope. When the smoke over Tokyo finally began to settle, the world had changed. Japan's capital lay in ruins, entire neighborhoods erased in a single night. The smell of ash and burned wood lingered for weeks, and the skies above the Kanto plain were blackened with the residue of melted steel and human tragedy. For the Japanese military command, the March raids were a revelation of horror and helplessness. The destruction was no longer confined to distant islands or isolated military bases. It had reached the heart of the empire itself. And above that devastation, the P-51 Mustang had carved its legend into history. In the weeks that followed, the Mustangs flew mission after mission from Iwo Jima, turning the island into one of the busiest fighter bases in the Pacific. Each morning, squadrons took off in staggered waves, silver aircraft shimmering in the dawn light, each carrying 400 gallons of high-octane fuel and 1,180 rounds of ammunition. They escorted B-29s over Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, anywhere American bombers aimed to strike. Their presence transformed the air war overnight. Where once the bombers had flown alone and unprotected, they now traveled under the vigilant watch of fighter escorts that could fight their way to Japan and back again. Japanese interceptors tried to adapt. Commanders experimented with high-altitude ambushes and night attacks, hoping to catch the bombers off guard. But the Mustangs were always there, gliding through cloud cover, attacking from the sun, and striking airfields before the defenders could even scramble. The Japanese Air Service had lost its edge. Many of its best pilots were already dead, and the new recruits, some barely in their 20s, faced an opponent they could neither outfight nor outrun. By late spring, air battles over Japan had become one-sided massacres. On April 7, 1945, during one of the largest raids against the Tokyo region, P-51 pilots from the 15th Fighter Group engaged Japanese interceptors over the city of Tachikawa. Within minutes, the sky turned into a swirl of vapor trails and fire. The Mustangs downed over 50 enemy planes for the loss of only 2 of their own. Similar results echoed across the country. The once proud Japanese air fleet, the same force that had devastated Pearl Harbor just 4 years earlier, was now reduced to fragments. Aircraft factories lay in rubble and fuel depots were empty. Japan had lost the war in the air long before its surrender on the ground. For the B-29 crews, the difference was unmistakable. The long flights that had once felt like death sentences now carried a fragile sense of safety. They still faced anti-aircraft fire and unpredictable weather, but the terror of fighter attacks was gone. Pilots spoke with reverence about the Mustangs, their silver-winged protectors who would appear suddenly beside them, flying just off the wingtips in tight formation. One navigator recalled how seeing a Mustang over Tokyo was the most comforting sight in the world. It meant we might live to see another sunrise. On Iwo Jima, the reality of that protection came at a cost. Many Mustang pilots never returned. The long range of their missions left little margin for error. A damaged fuel tank, an engine failure, or a single navigational mistake could mean death in the endless Pacific. Rescue efforts were constant. U.S. submarines and PBY Catalina flying boats roamed the waters beneath the bomber routes, searching for downed airmen. Some were pulled from the waves after days adrift. Others vanished without a trace. The price of air superiority was high, but the effect was decisive. In Tokyo, the psychological impact of the Mustangs was enormous. Civilians began reporting strange new details in their accounts of air raids. Smaller, faster planes flying lower than ever before, strafing power plants, bridges, and trains. The sound of the P-51's Merlin engine, a high-pitched metallic roar, became synonymous with terror. For those on the ground, it was the warning before the storm. The firebombing raids intensified through the spring, culminating in a series of nightmarish attacks that left more than 60 cities across Japan in ruins. By the summer of 1945, over half of Japan's urban area had been destroyed, and still the Mustangs flew. They strafed supply convoys, escorted bombers targeting industrial plants, and intercepted any Japanese aircraft still brave enough to rise. The Empire's once celebrated Air Force was now fighting with remnants, planes patched together from salvaged parts, fueled by alcohol mixtures instead of proper aviation fuel. Many couldn't even reach the altitude of the American formations. By July, the raids had become routine. Tokyo was bombed repeatedly, each time with less resistance. Osaka and Nagoya followed. The few Japanese planes that remained took off on what were essentially suicide missions. Some pilots, unable to climb fast enough to meet the bombers, aimed for ramming attacks, acts of sacrifice born from desperation. Even then, the Mustangs intercepted most before they ever reached their targets. The culmination came in August 1945. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked the final chapter of destruction. But by then, Japan's air power was already gone. The P-51 Mustangs had done their work months earlier, breaking the spine of Japan's aerial defenses and paving the way for the end. When Emperor Hirohito finally addressed his people to announce surrender, he spoke of the new and most cruel bomb, but in truth, Japan had already been beaten in the skies. When the occupation began, Japanese airfields told the story in silence. Rows of burned-out Ki-84s, Ki-61s, and Zeros lined the runways, their frames rusted and their propellers still. The Americans, now landing freely across the islands, were astonished by the scale of destruction. Some of the same Mustang squadrons that had once escorted bombers now patrolled peacefully over a defeated nation. And for the Japanese civilians who saw them up close for the first time, the sight was surreal. Sleek, gleaming aircraft with white stars painted on their wings, flown by men who had once been enemies. In interviews years later, surviving Japanese pilots recalled their first encounters with the Mustangs with a mix of awe and resignation. They came from nowhere, one said. We thought the Americans could never fly that far. But they did. They changed everything. Another described watching a formation of P-51s pass silently over Tokyo after the surrender. No gunfire, no bombs, just the hum of engines. They ruled the sky, he said softly. We could do nothing. The aftermath of that technological triumph reshaped both nations. For America, the P-51 symbolized the power of industrial ingenuity, a machine that embodied precision, endurance, and dominance. For Japan, it was a reminder of the cost of underestimating an enemy's ability to innovate. In less than 4 years, the war had moved from biplanes over China to long-range fighter escorts over the Japanese capital. The P-51 wasn't just a weapon, it was a statement that range, speed and will could erase any distance. By the war's end, the Mustang had escorted more than 15,000 B-29 sorties over Japan. It had destroyed over 4,900 enemy aircraft in air combat, and thousands more on the ground. But its most important victory wasn't measured in kills. It was in the silence that followed. After the Mustangs took the sky, Japan's airfields went quiet. The war in the air was over. But the question of what it meant, for technology, for humanity, for the world that followed, was only beginning. When the guns fell silent and the bombers no longer filled the sky, a strange stillness settled over the Pacific. The P-51 Mustang, once the spearhead of destruction, now sat motionless on Japanese airfields, its metal skin dulled by dust and salt air. The same aircraft that had once dived through enemy fire at 400 miles per hour now reflected only the calm light of peace. For many who had lived through it on both sides, the silence was almost unbearable. In that quiet, the Mustang's legacy began to take shape. It was not just a fighter plane. It was a symbol of what industrial resolve and technological imagination could achieve under pressure. In less than 4 years, American engineers had created a weapon that erased oceans, protected its bombers across impossible distances, and ended the age of Japanese air dominance. It represented more than steel and power. It embodied adaptation. The Mustang was born from necessity, refined through cooperation and perfected by experience. For Japanese airmen, the lesson was bitter but profound. They had once believed courage could overcome any technological gap. But bravery alone could not outfly radar, horsepower, or range. The Mustang was the visible proof that modern warfare was no longer about valor alone. It was about precision, logistics, and foresight. The Empire's best pilots had been defeated not by superior numbers but by an enemy that had turned science into art. Yet even in defeat, there was mutual respect. American pilots spoke of their Japanese opponents with admiration, men who fought with unmatched skill, often in hopeless conditions. Many Mustang veterans recalled the strange melancholy of flying over Tokyo after the surrender, looking down on a city they had once bombed, now quiet and broken. "We had conquered the skies," one said later, but there was no joy in it, only the weight of what we'd done. The Mustang's roar faded, but its influence endured. It would go on to serve in Korea, in Europe, and in the air forces of dozens of nations. It became an icon, not of victory but of transformation. It marked the end of an era when distance and isolation could protect nations from the reach of war. The sky had become a battlefield without borders. In the end, the Japanese airmen who had once watched those silver wings slice through their formations came to understand what the Mustang truly represented. It was the dawn of a new kind of warfare, where machines, not myths, determined the fate of nations. And as peace returned to the Pacific, one truth remained. The P-51 Mustang had not only conquered the air, it had rewritten the very limits of human reach. From that moment on, no horizon would ever be far enough again.